This video is sponsored by World Anvil. When you're starting a new campaign, you need to figure out where your first game is going to take place. Where are we going to join our heroes when the session begins? And you can just start in the middle of the action. A lot of great stories start that way. In fact, that might be the superior method, but we're going to talk more about that in a few days. But sometimes you want to start your game with all the characters in town together, and then you can use that domestic setting to bring the adventure to the players. But in order to do that, you need a good starting town. You need an actually interesting location where you can start the campaign. And that's the challenge that I was faced with last month as I got ready to run the first game of a new campaign. If you like this video, make sure to scroll down and hit the like button and the subscribe button, and that really does help the channel a lot more than I can say. In early December, I was getting ready for an in-person game of D&D, the same game we'd been talking about for more than a year with my wife and some of our friends who had never played D&D but were excited to try. We didn't play during the pregnancy because that was a really hard pregnancy and sitting in one place was asking a lot of my wife. And then we had a baby and, hot take, I guess, we didn't have a lot of free time. Plus our friends all got sucked into playing Baldur's Gate 3, so we had to wait for them to emerge from that hole. And then they were actually really excited to play. Now, back in October or November, I had tried to sit down and make a starting town, but it honestly just wasn't one that I was very excited about. I wasn't happy with what I was coming up with. I'd been trying to create a small town where adventure could happen, like Hamlet or Phandelver, but the town I'd come up with just wasn't inspiring to me. The plan for the game was to run the Delian Tomb, and so as I was rewatching a lot of Matt Colville's videos about starting towns, I was very consciously trying to make a small town in that same style as Hamlet or Lane. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that approach. Obviously, you know that I think Matt Colville has a lot of great advice, but the town I wound up creating just was not that interesting to me. Cut to early December, and as the game was getting closer and closer and I was doing more prep, I watched a great video by Mystic Arts DM, which is a fantastic new channel. If you haven't checked them out, go watch it, go subscribe. They are doing some fantastic work. But they made a video about why they never run a traditional Session 0, because rather than run a dedicated session where nobody gets to actually play the game, he handles a lot of these logistics via text before the first session. Again, watch the full video, he does a great job explaining that. And as I watched that video, I realized I basically do the same thing. I often message my players with questions about their characters, or their backstories, or their starting scenario, or what kind of adventure they want to play in. And I was definitely already doing that with this group, because I was offering to make all their characters in advance, rather than making everybody create their characters at the table during the first session. So I was texting my players and offering them choices about what features they wanted to take. Some of those players were more hands-off, choosing their species and class and background and then just leaving the rest for me to decide, while others really wanted to see a list of all the spells or know what each background option would give them, so we texted back and forth about those details and handled all of that through text. Returning to that video from Mystic Arts, the YouTuber, Daddy, come on, that's his name, he's from Iceland, don't make it weird. Well, in that video, Daddy mentioned that he also uses these pre-game text messages to essentially give some teasers for his game in the days leading up to the session. And I thought that was really a cool idea, and I thought that would be a lot of fun. So I decided, I want to do that too. I didn't have some super elaborate campaign planned out, but I would send them an intro to where the players are going to meet up for the first time in that first session, to give them a little bit of info about the town and maybe the inn itself. We're going to start in a tavern, a classic trope that we'll discuss in another video very soon, like I said. Now, around this time, I also started to rethink whether or not I was actually going to run the Delian Tomb after all. Did I just want to create my own adventure and run that instead? After all, I always kind of like the idea that a group of adventurers just happen to be the few people in the tavern when some crazy thing happens, and then they're just the ones who happen to stand up to volunteer. That's how the Delian Tomb opens, with the blacksmith staggering in and saying his daughter was abducted by goblins. However, I also like the approach where something major happens to the people in the tavern. I've done that a few times, and I'll talk about those in the tavern video very soon. I also kind of wanted to at least find some way of justifying the fact that these player characters are going to be the weirdest people in the room by quite a wide margin. Now, that didn't have to be the case. You can always run games where the tavern looks more like the Mos Eisley Cantina, but our group included a human, 2 Aasimar, a tiefling, and a dragonborn, and I maintain that when people play the weird ancestries, especially the ones with some sort of cosmic or celestial lineage, they want to be unusual characters, and it takes the wind out of their sails to have a whole bunch of other Aasimar hanging out in the corner booth when they come in. That's not always true, but speaking from my personal experience, I think that does tend to work best to introduce your players to a mostly human-centric starting location, because it gives them a really solid baseline to introduce them to the world, and it helps players show you whether they want to be regarded as weird and unusual by the everyday people of the world, or if that's not part of what excited them about that particular ancestry. But of course, you're still going to have that first session where a bunch of weirdos are the ones who rise up to go on the adventure. So even though I don't always succeed at this, I do at least try to come up with some sort of reason for why there are 4 or 5 very strange people who all just happen to be in the same town at the same time. I also wanted to create some handouts of plot hooks and bounties on a job board that the party could look into at the end of the first session, and get them excited about the next session, and maybe even decide what they wanted to go do. So I definitely wanted the adventure to start in a tavern so they could see that job board. There are lots of other fantastic ways to start campaigns. We'll probably talk about some of those throughout my video series about the many ways to structure your campaign, but I wanted to open in a tavern specifically because I wanted there to be a job board prop at the table in real life. This is something that I've kind of always wanted to do, but I haven't had an in-person game that wasn't Theater of the Mind or virtual or a podcast game in like 5 years. So this was finally my chance to run the tavern-based intro that I've had in my head for ages. Of course, I'd only gotten my friends to agree to a one-shot, so I didn't know if this was going to spin off into its own campaign, but even if it didn't, I wanted to give my friends the most iconic D&D experience that I could. And for me, a big part of that is starting in a tavern. Again, we'll talk more about that in another video very soon. But I also had an ulterior motive behind the job board, because I wanted this one-shot to lead into an opening campaign, but I also didn't want to hit my players with a scenario that would leave them without a clear resolution. I wanted to end the session with an invitation to go on another adventure, but I didn't want the players to feel like they had an obligation to go on another adventure. I didn't want them to think that I'd basically pressure them into a new campaign. But if the game ended and they were excited about playing again, I wanted to be able to point them to the job board and say, well, you know, if you want to look at these listings, you can choose your next adventure from these options. So, like I said, I decided I wanted to run a new adventure, not the Delian Tomb, but something where the danger would actually come into the tavern itself. So I rolled on some charts from the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, and I came up with a scenario where undead come up into the tavern out of a dungeon hidden beneath the building in town. And just like the Delian Tomb, they could abduct someone or a group of people, and then the heroes would have to chase them down into the dungeon to perform a daring rescue. Okay. Cool. I rolled in some more charts and determined that this dungeon was an old, forgotten temple beneath the village. I thought this could be a really cool introduction for a mega dungeon. But now that the dungeon was underneath the town, I really needed to know some more about the town itself. And additionally, in the back of my head, as I was doing all this work, I wanted to try to come up with a location that could work really well for other adventures and campaigns as well. After all, this one-shot might not wind up spinning off into a full campaign, but I still didn't want to just make a one-off location. I wanted someplace that I could bring other groups into, and that could potentially maybe even continue to evolve over time. So I busted out my copy of the Kobold Press book, Campaign Builder, Cities and Towns, and I started rolling on some more charts. The first results I got told me that the town was new and had been deliberately designed rather than popping up organically. As in, somebody said there should be a town here to serve some sort of function. And that's not at all what I was expecting, but I thought it was really interesting. And so I started thinking about what would cause a new town to be built on top of an old dungeon. I also rolled to determine the town's local politics, and through this process, I discovered that the town was a theocracy. And so I randomly rolled to see which of my gods from my pantheon would be worshipped by the rulers of this town. And I landed on the Crossroads god, Zalios. Zalios patrols the crossings and portals between planes of existence, but he also watches over travelers. And that really inspired me because I basically wound up determining that this new settlement was actually a fort that was built here to protect the road, specifically a trade route. The fort was initially built just as a set of crossroads as a way station for travelers to keep them safe. But very quickly it sort of accidentally became its own trade hub. Because, of course, if you're a trader stopping here for the night and there are other traders also staying here in the same fort for the night, you can just trade with them and then go back home early. The fort became a trading post because it literally cut everyone's travel time in half to just trade here instead of going on the rest of these long journeys into civilization. Now, my die roll had told me that this was a planned community, whereas what I just described sounds a little bit more accidental, that this fort essentially inadvertently became a community through convenience. But the purpose of these sorts of charts is never to lock you into a specific result, it's just to get your wheels spinning and inspire you. If it ends up leading you in a different direction, that's obviously fine. As another example of that same philosophy in action, I did roll to determine the settlement's purpose, but I hadn't gotten trade, I'd gotten timber, like their main export was lumber. But the idea of this being a trading town was just a lot more interesting to me. I'll definitely admit that I was at least partially inspired by Greyhawk, which I had literally just read about the week before. But I'm sure I was also inspired by locations from Matt Colville's campaign diaries, places like Tor Keep, which sounded like a fortress, but was actually just a thriving town. So I wanted this to be named with that same naming convention. It would be something Keep. So now I just had to come up with a name for that keep. At first I tried to find a surname or something that I liked, like Caldwell Keep or something like that, but nothing was really grabbing me. So instead, I started to wonder if it could be named after the environment instead. I played with a lot of compound words and different potentially ominous titles, and eventually I landed on Thornwood Keep. I really like this name because it told me that the starting town was actually right next to a big scary forest called the Thornwood, because that gives me a really exciting place to set adventures. Maybe the trees themselves are actually really strong or something like that. In fact, going back to the Cobalt Press book, when I initially rolled and determined that the settlement was known for its timber, which I ended up ignoring, they did literally suggest that the local lumber is stronger than usual, and that's why it's known for its timber. Now, I still didn't think that Thornwood Keep was currently a logging town, but since they're right next to the Thornwood, well, maybe there is actually a faction in town representing a logging company, and they're actually trying to start a lumber mill and basically start logging sections of the forest. And this could actually be really useful to me as a game master for two reasons. First, we have a faction that has an excuse to send people into the big scary forest. They hear about scary things going on and they hire the adventurers to go deal with them so their work can continue. But also, as the players begin to explore the forest and conquer it, you don't want all that travel to become tedious whenever they go back through these sections again. So maybe as they advance through the forest and begin conquering the lower level regions of the forest, at that point, maybe those areas effectively become safe enough that the logging company can step in and start clearing some of that forest away. And this could reduce the amount of travel the players have to do when they reach the levels where that travel becomes tedious, but also effectively represents the players taming the wilderness over many levels of gameplay. This idea that the town is a new trade hub right next to a dangerous forest also gave me a really good excuse to put the adventurers in town. People are coming here for adventure. They're coming here for work. This actually solves the problem I was wrestling with early in the process. I wanted some dynamic to put 5 adventurers together that actually made sense within the world, and now it did make sense. People come to the Thornwood Keep looking for jobs just like this one, jobs that take them into the Thornwood. That helps me justify why we have such a collection of weirdos that just happen to gather in the inn on a very auspicious night. It's not a coincidence that they're all here at the same time. No, it's essentially why this town has blossomed the way it has. Adventurers are coming here looking for work. So now that I basically knew what the town was, I started building the tavern, because that's where the players would be when the skeletons came up from the dungeon and snatched some people. I went back to my Cities and Towns book and rolled a bunch of times on a chart full of different components you can use to assemble a name. One of the results at this point was Soldier, which worked really well, considering this is a tavern where a bunch of soldiers get drunk between shifts protecting the fort. But I rolled a bunch of times for another word to add to the tavern name, and I was just never happy with those results. So instead I just sat and thought about what other words might fit nicely with Soldier, and I went up with the tavern name of The Singing Soldier. After all, this place literally would have been built so that soldiers could get drunk. Maybe they could also cut loose and party and sing, so maybe there's also a stage. Now, not all of these performers are soldiers, but a lot of them might be. And so next I rolled to come up with the names of the people who worked in the tavern, and determined that the bartender was Omar Yusupov, the cook was his wife Astrid, and the serving girl was their daughter Sabina. At this point, I realized that I was just assuming the dungeon was underneath the inn, and over time, this could become a popular place for a lot of adventurers to go exploring into the dungeon beneath the tavern, which is exactly the same premise as the Yawning Portal Tavern from the Forgotten Realms. And that's not a bad thing. The Yawning Portal is a great excuse for a home base that also keeps the adventurers right next to a dungeon. But I realized this dungeon didn't necessarily need to be under the tavern. That was just an assumption that I had made. So I checked out a chart in the Dungeon Master's Guide for quickly coming up with a building in town, and I rolled and I got a bookshop. Okay, that could be really fun as well. Back to Cities and Towns for a few more rolls for the name of the shop and the owner, and I got The Raven's Secret, owned by Giovanni Antonelli. However, a problem was starting to occur to me. I just placed this interesting adventure location right next to the town, the Thornwood. But then I was potentially placing the first level of a mega dungeon underneath the town as well, and that wasn't going to work for me, because Ben Robbins discovered when he first ran what became the West Marches style of play, if you place a danger or adventure inside the town, the players will never leave the town. That's why there are 2 books about dangers in Waterdeep, because there's enough there to keep the players entertained. I thought about moving the dungeon beneath a farmhouse just outside the city, another location that I randomly rolled for in the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, but that essentially posed the same problem. If there is a mega dungeon outside of town, but not inside the Thornwood, the players still won't go into the Thornwood. So it was time to move the dungeon into the Thornwood itself. But at this point, I also set aside the idea of this being a mega dungeon, specifically. I'm not opposed to there being a mega dungeon near town, like Castle Greyhawk being near Greyhawk. In fact, my recent exposure to that setting is probably why the idea of a nearby mega dungeon was so appealing to me. But I didn't know if these players were the right kind of players for a mega dungeon campaign, and I didn't want to put them in a situation where they felt like they had to keep going into this dungeon that wasn't going to be what they found fun. I was thinking about the fact that if this did become an ongoing campaign, my wife is one of the players, and she does not like ongoing stories with no clear end in sight. And that is essentially exactly what a Mega Dungeon campaign is. That's why I was introducing the job board format, so the players could have some other method of choosing which adventure to go on, and I wouldn't have to keep stringing them along in a seemingly endless adventure. I can take a lesson from the format of television and put episodic adventures in front of the party. And the entire premise of a Mega Dungeon doesn't really match that format, so I dropped the Mega Dungeon idea entirely. So now some monsters are going to come out of the forest, but it didn't make any sense for them to get into town and attack the party in the tavern. After all, this was now a keep. Of course I could change it, but I actually really liked what I'd come up with so far. I liked what I'd figured out about Thornwood Keep, and it worked well for the type of game I wanted to run. There were no threats inside the town, so if the players wanted to do awesome stuff, they had to leave the walls of Thornwood Keep and head out into the wilderness. So now this adventure wasn't going to open with monsters invading the tavern. I decided that the monsters could probably just attack somebody in one of the farmhouses outside of town. Then the farmer could come into town and recruit the heroes to go save his loved one. At that point, I realized that's just how the Delian Tomb starts. So I might as well go back to using that adventure and using that dungeon for the first session. So sure, I did wind up right back where I started, but now I had a new town that I was a lot more excited about. And one of the reasons I was especially excited about this town is because there was a built-in excuse for there to be a lot of adventures near here, thanks to the presence of the Thornwood. And that means that I can not just have a bounty board full of adventures for my players to go on in the future, but I can also use this town for multiple groups, maybe even more than one group at once. This is everything I've been looking for from my starting town. So in the spirit of that video from Mystic Arts DM, I tracked down a picture of a keep or a walled town that I could use to represent Thornwood Keep. I started typing up a very brief description of the town that I could send to my players. But then I realized that rather than sending them a wall of text and a picture, I should just send them a link that they could check out. Which means I genuinely did use today's sponsor, World Anvil. I actually asked them to sponsor this video because for the entire rest of this process I'm going to talk about, I used World Anvil for all of it. This isn't an ad that's tangential to the video, it's the rest of the story. I created a new world in World Anvil and started adding details about everything I've described to you today. A brief page about the Thornwood Keep, a very brief page about the Thornwood itself, a very brief page for the Church of the Crossroads, and some brief entries for each of the gods that came up during these descriptions, which actually gave me a fun way to start incorporating connections and conflicts between some of the gods. Hey, it's Editing Mike here. Real quick, I know the ad is integrated into the video itself, but I forgot I actually do still need to hit the talking points I'd normally hit in an ad. I need to give you the coupon code. So make sure you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code supergeek at checkout to save 51% off your annual membership. Once again, that is worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code supergeek at checkout to save 51% off your membership. Okay, thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring the video. Now let's get back to the point I was in the middle of making. I'm so good at making videos. Okay, back to it. Now, this wasn't the first time I started building a world in World Anvil, but this time actually felt different. Last time I just had a bunch of scattered ideas and didn't really have a way to connect them. I knew I wanted there to be a creepy valley full of skeletons and that would be out there somewhere. I had an idea for a spooky forest, but no idea where I was going to put it yet. And so I never really got any traction when I was building that world, but I just didn't know why. I knew the process wasn't working for me, but couldn't figure out what was wrong. Likewise, a few years ago when I made the Pantheon on a Patreon livestream, I also randomly generated a huge world map. But I wasn't really inspired to create more detail for that version of the setting either. I really liked the gods that I'd come up with, and I've since used them on my channel and in my home games, but the map itself hadn't given me as much inspiration as I'd hoped. But cut to now, and by the time I created this starting town, I was coming up with a different perspective. I'd literally read about Greyhawk and seen how that setting had blossomed out of just a couple of locations, the city of Greyhawk and Castle Greyhawk. And that did inspire me. Sure, at this point I don't know who the kings or barons are of this world, I don't know the name of the country we're in, I don't know a lot of the stuff that I usually start with. But apparently I didn't actually need any of those in order to feel inspired. This town wasn't run by a noble, it had been founded by the church, and that gave me plenty to work with, especially because pantheons and religions are the part of the process that I most enjoy designing. So having a town, a fortress run by the church, was actually really exciting for me. Plus that idea definitely tells you a lot about the world already. Even if not all temples and faiths and churches have that level of institutional power, clearly there's some significant power held by the clergy in the setting. But through this process, I essentially realized that I didn't need an entire sprawling campaign setting already designed. The reason I felt like I did was because I do need that when it comes to the pantheon of my games. The idea of not having a suite of gods already figured out before we start playing just does not work for me. That idea really stresses me out. The most exciting work I'd done so far in this setting had been when I built that pantheon. But trying to come up with the rest of the entire world wasn't daunting, it just wasn't grabbing me. But when prepping this one-shot, I finally come around to the idea that the rest of the world really can wait until I figure out what I need to know before the next game. And this is the funny thing. I essentially backed into the most common piece of world-building advice we get in this hobby. Start small. Everybody tells new game masters, everybody says, not to try to build an entire world from scratch. Instead, just start with a local area and work from there. But I can tell you that I always thought I needed more than that. After all, For my pantheons, I knew I wanted a full roster of gods before my first game. I can't even begin to approach a new campaign without that information. And I've tried to approach games with a very loose sketch of the world, and it didn't work for me. So I thought I needed to fully detail out my campaign setting, or at least a decent chunk of it, before continuing. But looking back, the problem with that other game wasn't that the world didn't have enough detail, it was that it didn't have interesting details that inspired adventures. The game I was running couldn't take place anywhere, so I wasn't getting any benefit from the campaign setting. So at first I learned the wrong lesson. I thought I had to build a whole world before my first game because it seemed like that's what I lacked the last time. But here I finally come around to the idea that you can just start with a local area and just start adding detail from there. And that includes not just details on the maps, like forests and dungeons and whatever, but also political details and histories and things like that. So far, I really do feel like I only need to create new details when I need them for my games. Now, will that stay the case? I don't know. Maybe at some point I'll figure out a bunch of details about the rulers of the region, more than I need to just run the next session. But in that case, I can just trust that I will feel a flash of inspiration, and that will be why I'm building out an entire kingdom or family or hierarchy or whatever. I won't actually start doing that work until the point where I actually need it for the game, or I'm just feeling particularly inspired because I'll be catching up on House of the Dragon or whatever. But either way, it still means that I won't feel like I'm forced to do top-down world building when that's not what's exciting to me.
So in your starting town, is there a local wizard? Maybe someone who wears purple robes?
So here's the interesting thing. At first I didn't include a local wizard because I kind of wanted this world to just be a fresh start. If there's going to be a local wizard, it can be one of the player's characters when that character eventually retires from adventuring, you know, that kind of thing. But so far I've run 2 games that started in the Thornwood Keep, and the second time, it really would have helped the story a lot if there had been a local wizard who could answer questions about the arcane. So I am considering adding a local wizard.
Oh, you're gonna put me in your games?
I'm just saying that I'm thinking about it. It turns out that having a friendly wizard around is kind of helpful. That's all I'm saying, and that's all I'm committing to so far.
I'll take it.
Thanks so much for watching. Come back soon for more videos. I've got so much that I'm really excited to talk about in the next few weeks. Make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell and support the channel on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. It really helps a lot. Sign up for my Discord or my newsletter in the links below. I would really appreciate it. Speaking of campaign settings, click here to watch my latest video about what makes for a great cover for a published D&D campaign setting. I think that was a lot of fun to talk about. Until next time, play fair and have fun.